Please welcome Helen Thomas.
I do lament the passing of many family newspapers. The owners used to really make their money in real estate business, and the newspapers was their contribution to the community, not bonanza profit, which they are asked to produce now. Now the shareholders on Wall Street demanding 25–30% unheard of profits in newspapers. And that's the rub. But I do believe there will always be a place for newspapers, certainly good reporters. Of course, the blanket coverage, the word media, takes a beating, easy target for losing candidates, blame the messenger. Sometimes it is warranted. Up to now, there has been no real question of the free ride that Barack Obama has gotten. And it's only after Saturday Night Live really did lampoon the reporters, sycophantic press, that the reporters began to wake up against all the candidates. Hillary Clinton, who carries more baggage, has been having been in the public eye for so long, much longer, is taking it on the chin. You might not want to have a beer with her, but she sure does know how to slug down a Boilermaker. Not that that makes you a candidate for president. As for the Republican presidential candidate, a maverick who has turned chameleon. Everything he stood for in 2000, he has turned around again 180 degrees. So desperate is he. Former prisoner of the Hanoi Hilton has now endorsed President Bush's veto of the ban on torture. Can you believe it? I've never seen the worst times for our country, any worse times. Domestically, that is, economically, we are in the tank and getting worse. Laissez-faire in business has caught up with us with deregulation, no constraints on the financial world, greed, globalization, housing foreclosures, and only a whiff of a New Deal solution with government intervention where it possibly can save us again. Draining us is a war without end. Even gloomier were the two top Americans in Iraq, military and diplomatic, who recently testified on Capitol Hill and brought us only the bad news. At least they were honest, devoid of the usual spin. President Bush is determined to run out the clock for the debacle that he has inflicted on the Middle East. The new president has to call it quits. This war against Iraq is illegal, immoral, unconscionable, and unforgivable. It's based purely on deception. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, no ties to the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, no threat from a third world country to the world's only military superpower, no Iraqis in 9/11. If I asked anyone in this room why we went to war, I would get, or everyone, several answers, guesses. That's no way to go to war. Oil, says Greenspan. Daddy, says others. Upstaging his dad, Bush 41. Israeli fears. 5 years into this war, 1 million Iraqis dead, 4,000 Americans dead, and plus 29,000 wounded, 4 million Iraqi refugees. Neighboring countries are now closing their doors to them. The neocons who drafted the blueprint for this war are now jumping ship. They've escaped to safe houses, universities, right-wing think tanks, free of blame of the debacle that they promoted. It was going to be a cakewalk, remember? 4 days and we're out of there. Well, it may be a surprise to us, but people, even Iraqis, will fight and die for their country against an invader and an occupier. And unfortunately, that's us. My solution, get out of Iraq yesterday. Bring in UN peacekeepers to stabilize the country that we have destroyed. Allow the Iraqis who collaborated with us in the invasion, the occupation, whose lives will be at stake, to come here. Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of the Army in World War II, and later president, warned us against the military-industrial complex. War itself, when he said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense the theft from those who hunger and those who are and are not fed, those who feel cold and are not clothed. Now I think I should lighten up, don't you? I came to Washington during World War II determined to be a reporter covering the big story. And Liz Carpenter had graduated from the University of Texas about the same time, came to Washington on the same mission. We were knocking on doors at the National Press Building. And Liz later became a great Texas newswoman and press secretary to Lady Bird Johnson. Well, P.T. Barnum had nothing on her. She could sell the Washington Monument. In those days, Liz was always on the plump side. Well, who wasn't? And she ran out of money a couple of days before I did, wired her brother in Austin, please send me $200 or I'm going to have to sell my body. He wired back, sell it by the pound. She had a great sense of humor, and when the Johnson White House days were over, I took her to lunch near the White House, and she was dropping me off at the White House press room and going on to the press building a few blocks. And I said to her, Liz, what do you miss the most about the White House? And quick as a flash, she said, power. I had never heard that word from a woman before. When she got back to her office, the newsman next door, in office next door, his little boy came in and told Liz, I do magic. Good, she said, make Nixon disappear. So having been watching presidents with a jaundiced eye, I can tell you, they should be watched. They have great power, life and death, over all of us today. Every issue comes to the White House some way, somehow, from Turkey Track to World War II, to War and Peace. And that's why we should pick good people with a good sense, good conscience, that would help to lead us all out of this wilderness. We do have a historic moment. First viable woman candidate, first viable black candidate. I've reversed my greatest criticism for Congress and the press. Congress signed off on many laws that have limited our freedom without a squeal from the public. The press rolled over and played dead after 9/11, failing to challenge the falsehoods. They were afraid to be called unpatriotic, un-American if they challenged the administration. Came out of their coma after Katrina debacle when their powers that be told them they could challenge the administration. As for myself, I've always felt greatly privileged to cover the White House and to have a daily ringside seat to instant history. We in the press are the only institution in our society who can question a president on a regular basis and hold him accountable. Too much is at stake to toss him softballs, and there has been too much deference on the part of reporters, as I say, who were afraid to challenge. I thought that I'd give you my take on the 9 presidents I've covered. John F. Kennedy, the most inspired. He had vision. He created the Peace Corps. He'd been to war. He understood the risks of statesmanship. He also made the far-fetched prediction that we would land men on the moon in a decade. Didn't live to see it, but we did it. And during his first year in office, he invited the first class of astronauts to the White House for an informal supper with their wives. And during the mix and mingle, Kennedy asked the astronauts, do you think we could land men on the moon? They said, sure, absolutely. Never say no to a president. When they left the White House, they said, is this guy nuts? Is he crazy? Land on the moon? Lyndon B. Johnson, bigger than life, moved the mountain, made the greatest contribution to our country on the domestic side in the last half of the 20th century. He'd been majority leader in the Senate. He knew every man's price. He knew where all the bodies were buried. In his first 2 years in office, on the tailwind of the Kennedy assassination, he was able to ram through Congress Medicare, which Truman first proposed, the Civil Rights Act, voting rights for blacks for the first time in the South, federal aid to education at all levels from Head Start through college, public housing, national parks, environmental laws, you name it, the Great Society. After pushing civil rights, some of his Southern cronies came to him and complained, what is this, Lyndon? When you were Senate Majority Leader, you were a Southerner. You were one of us. He said, I'm president now, president of all the people. We all know that Vietnam was his undoing. There was another war on the home front, widespread daily protests. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Richard Nixon always had two roads to go, and he always took the wrong road. He did make the breakthrough trip to China, divide and conquer, knowing the hostility between the Soviet Union and China at that time. But his dark side prevailed. Watergate scandal made him the first president in American history to be forced to resign from office. Well, as you can see, I don't waste my sympathy on presidents. They die for the job. They collect an obscene amount of money, make promises to their bankrollers that they cannot keep, and rarely are they true profiles in courage that we hope they will be. The late President Gerald Ford stepped into the presidency, never thought he wanted to be Speaker of the House, restored confidence in the White House in the aftermath of Watergate, and he told us that the long national nightmare was over. But his pardon of Richard Nixon, 1 month after Ford took office, did not sit well with the voters. Jimmy Carter made human rights at the centerpiece of his foreign policy. He has won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's a very honored past president. He's in demand all over the world for disputes because both sides know he will be fair. Ronald Reagan turned the country to the right. There was a Reagan revolution. He said government was the problem, not the solution. But most of his people really milked at the public trough. He started an arms race with the Soviet Union, which was staggering economically at the time. And with the help of Mikhail Gorbachev, who opened the windows a bit for new ideas, the Pope, blue jeans, rap music, exchange students, exchange teachers, he helped to end the Cold War. George H.W. Bush, 41, liberated Kuwait in the first Gulf War, had the good sense not to go on to Baghdad after victory on grounds that there might be a civil war, house-to-house fighting. Can you imagine that? He lost his bid for re-election because of the downbeat economy. Bill Clinton, consummate politician, worked for peace in the Balkans, Northern Ireland, Middle East, but tarnished his office with an affair with an intern. He did leave a surplus in the Treasury, which has now been dissipated by war. Never had the courage to take the big steps for peace that makes for greatness. He won't wind up on Mount Rushmore. President Bush, simple philosophy, black and white, with us or against us, dead or alive, good and evil. He has hurt his party and the country with a pointless, mindless war, broke down the wall of separation of church and state. He's made end runs around the Constitution, and he's chosen an attorney general who can't decide whether waterboarding is torture. No president has ever liked the press, dating back to George Washington. I wasn't covering him, but much as he railed against the press, Thomas Jefferson said that if he had a choice between government and newspapers, he would pick newspapers. Kennedy said, "I'm reading more and enjoying it less." What LBJ said is unprintable. Nixon looked up once when we poured into the cabinet room for a picture taking. He said, "It's only coincidental that we're talking about pollution when the press walks in." President Ford likened my questions to acupuncture. And he said that if God had created the world in 6 days, on the seventh day he could not have rested. He would have had to explain it to Helen Thomas. When President Reagan was told that a press helicopter had been fired on at the Honduran border by the Sandinista Marxists, he said, "There's some good in everyone." President Clinton was asked why the press always went along in motorcade when he went jogging. He laughed and said, "They just want to see if I drop dead." That's true. We are on what we call the body watch. Is it still alive? When Al Newharth, founder of USA Today, went to Havana a few years ago, he asked Castro, "Now what's the difference between your democracy and ours?" Castro said, "I don't have to answer questions from Helen Thomas." Well, I have many memories in covering the White House. I remember Kennedy's off-the-cuff remark at a news conference. He said, "Life is unfair." And I remember when we asked Kennedy on Air Force One, what would happen if the aircraft crashed? He said, "I know one thing, your name will be just a footnote." Well, like most presidents, LBJ had a stable of speechwriters. Once he asked that a certain speech be prepared. Writer brought it the first draft. He looked at it and he said, Voltaire. People I'm going to talk to don't know who Voltaire is." Grabbed a pen, scratched out Voltaire, and scribbled in, "As my dear old daddy used to say." We were often invited to the LBJ Ranch for dinner. And once Johnson asked Bill Moyers, who had been a Baptist minister, to say grace. Moyers bent his head, began to pray, and Johnson commanded, "Speak up, Bill." "I wasn't talking to you, Mr. President," Moyers replied. When LBJ was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital just outside of Washington for gallbladder surgery, the psychiatric ward had been transformed into a press room. "What happened to the patients?" Johnson asked Moyers. "We gave them all press cards," Moyers said. And then there was Midge Costanza, in charge of women's affairs, Carter administration. She said, "I don't mind Carter being born again, but did he have to come back as himself?" I remember asking Billy Carter, his brother, if he too had been born again. He said, "Once is enough." And then there was my favorite, Miss Lillian, Carter's mother, who said, "Sometimes when I look at my children, I wish I'd remained a virgin." When Carter won his presidential election, a reporter ran up to her and said, "Aren't you proud of your son?" She said, "Which one?" And I remember interviewing her in Plains, Georgia in 1976. She was still fuming over a French woman correspondent who had belabored Carter's campaign promise never to lie. Kept asking her, what did he really mean by that? Finally, she said to Miss Lillian, "Do you lie?" Miss Lillian said, "Well, I tell a little white lie." "Well, what do you mean by a little white lie?" In total exasperation, Miss Lillian said, "You remember when you came through that door and I told you how beautiful you looked?" And then there was Henry Kissinger, man with a mammoth ego. A woman ran up to Kissinger and said, "Oh, Dr. Kissinger, thank you for saving the world." He said, "You're welcome." Adlai Stevenson said, "Democracy is great, not only because the majority prevails, but because it's safe to be in the minority. Winston Churchill said, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been invented." Kennedy told the students at American University after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he and Khrushchev had arsenals to blow up the world, and each had the courage of cowardice to step back. He said, America would never start a war. Our generation has had enough of hate and war. We want a world where the weak are secure and the strong are just. Jefferson said, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." Justice Brandeis said, "A constant spotlight on public officials lessens the possibility of corruption." He also said that if the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for the law. At the end of World War II, President Truman sent Justice Robert Jackson, came from upstate New York, to Nuremberg to prosecute the Nazi war criminals. Nazi generals told Jackson, "We're on trial because we lost the war." "No," he said, "you're on trial because you started a war." During the Martin Luther King March on Washington, we all remember his immortal speech, "I have a dream." But I remember even more a cameo appearance by a rabbi on that same program. We'd spent years Hitler's war camp, concentration camp. He said, "The greatest sin of all in the Nazi era was silence." Lincoln said, "Let the people know the facts. The country will be safe." I believe that. So ask not for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for all of us. Let's give peace a chance. Let it begin with us. And I want to offer my congratulations to the winners who have kept the light on truth. Thank you very much.
So what do you give Helen Thomas after she says all that, right? Hard to figure out, but we did find out she has something of a sweet tooth. So we asked a local chocolate family, the Lazar chocolate family. They've been in the business here for 4 generations of making chocolate. They made you a special candy bar, the one and only, the official Fair Media Council candy bar, so you can enjoy it on your trip back to Washington.
Thank you.
A little something special for you. We do thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Thank you.